as pastors to worship our King. And in our text we see that God was doing just that. God was doing that through the instruction of Paul to Titus. And this letter in Titus, it was written a few decades after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And when Christ ascended into heaven, He told His disciples, the Great Commission says, "Go and make disciples of all nations." And since then, and around that time, God raised up men to be apostles during that time. And they led God's people to plant faithful churches. And the Apostle Paul was one of those men. And the Apostle Paul led Titus to go and lead pastors who would then lead others. How should we understand the importance of church leadership? What does it look like? And what should we do with it? This takes us to our first point I want us to take away from this text. Number one, we have faithful leaders when we celebrate the gospel with them. Look at verse 1. We see that the Apostle Paul, he wrote this letter to Titus. He writes starting out with his name. And it's a very personal letter, and it brings a beautiful introduction. One of the more lengthy introductions here of one of Paul's letters. That lengthy introduction is right here in these verses. So this is writing to Paul, and we see that it's written to Titus. Verse 4, it says, "To Titus, my true child in the common faith." Because Paul was like a spiritual father to Titus. He was a mentor of Titus. Paul was a man that poured into Titus with love and a brotherly relationship. And it was a brotherly relationship that was full of gospel truth. You can say that he discipled Titus. And in that discipleship, they celebrated the gospel together. They celebrated the gospel by their unity in the gospel. They were brothers in the faith. And this is why he can write to Titus and say, "To Titus, my true child in a common faith." Because they have a common salvation in Jesus Christ. And in this, he blesses Titus with a personal letter. And it makes me think, and it makes us think, isn't it a blessing to get a letter from somebody? It's not as common, I think, in our day with phones, text, email, social media, but I still know people that write letters every once in a while and write letters to me and write thank you cards to me as well and just, birthday cards and that kind of thing. And it is a blessed thing to receive. And in this personal letter to Titus, there's a lot here in these opening lines for us to see. Paul says that he is a servant of God. He serves as a servant of God and as an apostle of Jesus Christ. And he is both of those things. He says, for the sake of the faith of God's elect, that is, all of God's people, right, across all time and all places. He says, for the sake of that, these believers and their knowledge of the truth that accords with godliness, that is, their transformation according to the gospel. Because the gospel does not apply to us if we do not believe it. And this does not mean simply believing that the gospel is true or even that the gospel